One of the bills passed by the state legislature during this past session, and then vetoed by Governor Phil Scott, and then the veto overridden by the state legislature during its June veto override session, was H 289, which updated the state's renewable energy standard. The renewable energy standard was originally set in 2005 and then updated in 2015. It mandates that the state's electric power should come from renewable energy sources. The latest update, passed by the legislature this year, will require the state's electric utilities to obtain all of their electricity resources from renewable sources by January 1st, 2030. To learn more about the possible impacts of the new standard and its possible pressure on individual electric bills, we turn to two experts in the energy field in Vermont. Matt Coda is a consultant who provides management and advocacy assistance to Vermont trade associations focused on energy, transportation, communications, housing, and economic development. Before that, he was the executive director of the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association. Peter Sterling is the executive director of Renewable Energy Vermont, the nonprofit trade association representing businesses working towards a fossil fuel-free future for Vermont.
Big picture, this is something that has been in the pipeline, so to speak, for the last 15 years. It really began under Governor Shumlin with the idea that rather than find the least cost source of energy and electricity, to focus on finding the energy that has the least carbon. And how do you incentivize the marketplace so that utilities will be required to or compelled to not only procure energy that comes from less polluting resources, but also to increase the amount of electricity sold. And that's a really key point here. You know, our energy policy for decades has been to find the lowest cost electron and to ensure that that people use less so that you build less power plants and there's less cost on ratepayers in terms of poles and wires. And that flipped. And I think there isn't often talked about, but you know, the whole idea behind creating an efficiency utility was to reduce the amount of electricity that Vermonters consume. That's when it was created 25 years ago with that specific intent. And that changed. Now it's the idea is to use more electricity, not less, but more, and to replace fossil fuels used for heating, cooking, and for transportation, to replace it with devices that consume electricity. So with that becomes a radical transformation in how we acquire energy, in how we use appliances in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this legislation is part of that broader movement to increase the amount of electricity we use for transportation and for heating, and to ensure that that electricity comes from renewable resources, less carbon polluting resources. And this bill, which would require a greater amount of those electrons to come from new local, meaning Vermont-based power producers. So that's the big picture of where we're going. And this is a small part of that movement that has taken over 15 years to get to where we are today, and will be at least another 2 decades before we see whether or not it actually works. Any energy observer, policy observer, which I have been for the last 2 decades, can see what this will do. Even the advocates admit that it will increase the costs of our electric bills. And there's some disagreement about whether it will add another $200 to our bill a year or another $500 to our bill a year. That will all get worked out in the marketplace, but it will, from all sides, will agree that it will increase the cost of using electricity for our lights and power, for our homes and businesses, but also, of course, as we begin this transformation, for the power that we need for our electric vehicles and electric heat and air conditioning. So I think the opponents of the bill, if there were opponents to it, was based on cost. No, it wasn't the idea that we should burn wood or coal in order to produce more electricity. It was saying what is the cost going to be should this policy be implemented? And we're going to see over the next 10 years which predictions prove true. Now, if we find that the costs of new renewables in state goes down, then the higher cost predictions, the high end of the predictions won't come true. If it's actually the cost of in-state renewables goes up, then we will see much larger increases in our electric bill. And that could affect the transformation that that many want, which is to increase the amount of electricity that we use for transportation and for heating. As those costs go up, people might be reluctant to buy an electric vehicle. People might be reluctant to rely more on electric heat and may continue to use fossil fuels because of the cost of energy. So that's the risk that these advocates take, which is if you push a policy that increases the costs of electricity, you increase the costs of not only just turning on your computer and turning on the lights, but also cooking and heating and transportation. So the electric utilities were stakeholders in the development of this bill, and of course the largest electric utility is Green Mountain Power, which has 4 out of every 5 homes in Vermont. It's owned by a Canadian company called Énergir, which is the largest natural gas provider in Quebec, and that company certainly was involved in the creation and the passage of this legislation. That's not a secret. And I think part of it was that negotiation over how much power must come from in-state renewables and new renewables. So, and that's an effort to ensure that they, even though they have a guaranteed rate of return and a monopoly, electric utilities certainly don't want, are looking to increase costs without reason. So I think that was part of the negotiation, which is if they want to sell more electricity, which they do for the transportation and heating market, and in fact they're compelled to by state law, they want to make sure that it is at least somewhat affordable. Meanwhile, those that want to promote in-state renewable power projects want to make sure they get a guaranteed rate of return. And the way that it can ensure that is by requiring utilities to purchase their power. So you had a very careful negotiation between those that buy power and sell it to consumers and those that are promoting in-state renewable energy projects, and those that don't want to rely on, as we do every year, in the middle of winter. We are a winter peaking state. We use more electricity on the coldest day in January than we do on the hottest day, the coldest night in January than the hottest night in July. And when we do that, we rely on fossil fuels. We rely on coal plants. We rely on heating oil that powers generators in Albany and in Connecticut to create the electricity that we need to power our homes, our cars, and our cooking and heat. So the big idea is, how do you defeat the peak? How do you ensure that when we need to turn on that standby generation, that it is not fossil fuels and it is in fact more electric power? And part of that is creating more local electric production and not relying on ISO grid in relying on Hydro-Quebec. So it's a complicated dance in figuring out not how to get most power on a cool sunny fall day, but how to ensure that you have the power that you need when you need it most. And in Vermont, it's at the coldest night in January is when we peak, when we need the most amount of power. So I think the renewable energy standard is sort of a long time coming, and it's an update of the 2015 law. So it was less controversial than what happened at the first part of this biennium, and will reemerge in January, and that's the clean heat standard. So the clean heat standard was passed in 2023. It was overridden after a veto by Governor Scott. The first year it was in 2022, it was passed, and it was defeated by just one vote. The second year it passed by just one vote. That was in the state Senate. And the election will be surely tell us what will happen in January. But here's what is happening now. So I am on the Public Utility Commission Technical Advisory Group and Equity Advisory Group, and we've been tasked by the legislature to design a policy that reduces greenhouse gas emissions in the thermal sector and heating. And the clean heat standard is the way that they want to achieve that. It's one of the recommendations of the Climate Council. Right now, we're developing the rule, which we'll present to the legislature in January, but it will determine how, in fact, we reduce greenhouse gas emissions in accordance to the Global Warming Solutions Act. That's the 2020 law that says we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 1990 levels by the end of the decade, by 2030. So the Climate Council said, how about try out this clean heat standard? The legislature passed it. Now it's up to us, the Technical Advisory Group and the Public Utility Commission, to design a policy that does, in fact, that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And the big question that everyone is asking, and no one knows yet, but we will soon, which is, what do you need to do in order to achieve that mandate to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40%? What are the things that you need? How many homes need to be weatherized? How many heat pumps need to be installed? How much biodiesel, renewable fuels need to be sold in order for you to meet that 40% number? And then furthermore, what will it take to move the market? What will it take to convince Vermonters, if you know what you need to do in order to reach the mandate, how much do you need to incentivize the market to make it happen? What policies do you need to put in place to encourage either incentives or mandates or grants or workforce development? How do you make it all happen? That's a big question and a big task. And right now, the Public Utility Commission is just trying to figure out whether they can figure it out, present a rule to the legislature in January that says, here's what has to happen in order to meet your mandate. Here's how much that's going to cost. And then after that, it's simple division, and we'll know how much Vermonters will pay if the legislature passes the clean heat standard into law in January of next year. So if it's going to cost $1 billion in order to implement this, well, we know that it will add $1 a gallon to the price of heating oil and propane. And that's more than what people will be able to pay, and it will have disastrous effect on our communities. If it costs $100 million in order to incentivize the market, well, then that's 10 cents a gallon. And that will have less of a financial impact on most Vermonters, but will have a very significant impact on low and moderate income Vermonters. And that's kind of the work we're doing right now with the Equity Advisory Group, determining if this clean heat standard, in fact, makes it more inequitable, increases the cost for low income Vermonters to heat their homes, and in fact makes it more challenging for them to begin a transition where they have lower energy costs. You combine that with the bill that we were talking about previously, which requires an increase in renewables in the electricity market, thereby increasing the cost of electricity. At the same time, we have policies that are encouraging people to use more electricity for heat and for transportation. It's going to be an interesting next 5 years, because hanging in the balance is a lawsuit. Remember, the Global Warming Solutions Act, passed in 2020, allows anyone to sue the state of Vermont should we not meet these very specific mandates on greenhouse gas reductions, 40% below 1990 levels. If 2030 comes around in just 5.5 years, and we don't, anyone could sue the state and compel the Agency of Natural Resources, the Secretary of Agency of Natural Resources, whoever that is in 2030, to implement regulations without the approval of the full legislature, just through the regulatory process, to met regulations in order to achieve that mandate. What could that mean? We don't know. But over the next 5 years, it's going to be a very challenging environment in which consumers are going to have to determine whether or not, and voters are going to have to determine whether or not this type of investment in this future makes sense, or whether or not it will further increase the costs of living in this cold rural state where we currently need gas-powered vehicles and fossil fuel heated homes.
Then we turn to Peter Sterling for his point of view.
First, it's important to understand that when Vermonters are not getting power from renewables, wind and solar, Hydro-Quebec, the power that the electricity we get comes from burning almost all the time natural gas. Okay, our grid, our power comes from the New England grid. There are 62 natural gas plants that run baseload power. None of those power plants are in Vermont. All 62 are in other New England states. So, long story short, when Vermonters need extra power, when we don't have enough power from renewables, almost all the power we get comes from natural gas plants that are located in primarily low-income and people of color communities in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and sometimes New Hampshire, but mostly Massachusetts and Connecticut. So when you ask me your question, why is it important that we get to 100% renewable energy? To me, a big part of it is an equity and a justice issue, that Vermonters should not be exporting the consequences of their need for electricity, which we all want, to low-income and people of color communities who live near natural gas plants in other states. We have no natural gas plants in Vermont. We would never cite one here. And so to me, the importance of H289 is taking those natural gas plants offline. By the way, the amount of new renewables that come online as a result of this bill is the equivalent of taking 240,000 cars off the road by 2035. That's how much less pollution will go into the air because of this bill. The equivalent of removing almost a quarter million cars. That is a significant achievement for a little state like Vermont.
But one of the concerns, I guess, that has been expressed is that it may also increase prices of electricity or heating fuels or whatever. Is that a concern you share?
Yeah. Well, first, it won't affect heating fuel. This is only about electricity. The first thing I would say, and bigger picture, I think we have to start at the place where we agree that Vermont is in the middle of a climate crisis. Last summer's flooding, right? Statewide, I mean, there was flooding in Ludlow, in Londonderry, Montpelier was underwater, Middlebury got hit. Like, we have to do something. Vermont has to play its part to stop the climate crisis. And will that be free? Will switching from a fossil fuel-based economy that's been, where so many costs are externalized, all the social cost of carbon is externalized, will that be free? Of course not. Someone has to pay something to move our economy off of fossil fuels. However, when you actually look, given that the price of large wind, large solar has been coming down, I don't believe the cost will be significant. Most Vermonters will not see this on a bill. Our estimate was by 2030, this will add $3 a month or so to someone's bill. That being said, I think $3 a month is a lot to some people in Vermont. There's a lot of Vermonters who are struggling right now, and we don't want to make it harder. Renewable Energy Vermont and our whole coalition of groups that supported this bill was united in saying there needs to be some kind of ratepayer protection law passed that makes sure that the lowest income Vermonters among us have their energy bills capped, limited, and this way they can receive the benefits of electrification too. So we do believe that if you do this bill and then cap low-income Vermonters' electric bills, that would be a much more equitable system. When we have legislation advancing that will help the legislature, pass that kind of ratepayer protection law. So it's really two prongs. One is make sure we have all the renewable energy we need. do it in a way that will keep rates low, but make sure that the lowest income Vermonters among us don't have to pay too much.
I guess what do you see as the best way to get kind of a buy-in from people who, for one reason or another, think that driving a gasoline-powered car is just fine, and heating with oil and propane is what's wrong with that? Uh, how do you counter those arguments?
Well, it's funny, I'm on my town energy committee too, and we had the exact same conversation about the drafty town garage, which once we saw the heating bill, you can't believe it. It's like heating the outside world, right? And then, yeah, so that's pretty funny. Well, the first thing I'll say to your question, I think it's a great question. First of all, if you're under 30 years old, you do not have that attitude. Like, I have two teenagers. They are very aware that something's wrong and that this older generation's responsibility is to start doing stuff. So when we got our electric car, my kids didn't think it was weird. They thought, oh, this is the right thing to do. I was talking to a TV reporter for a big TV station, and we were talking about perceptions about solar panels and that, and it basically came out that no one under 30, when they see a solar panel in a field, they don't think that's a bad thing. They see that as a sign of hope. They see it as a sign of Vermonters taking control of their energy future, doing something to stop climate change. I would probably push back on you is most of the people who push back on this kind of thing, oh, I don't need it, my gas car's fine. They're over 40, they're a little more stuck in their ways, but the younger generation is very much into this kind of change and supportive of it. So when I go around, I don't hear that, I don't get that much blowback from younger people, which gives me a lot of hope. I think particularly with electric vehicles, it just takes a little bit of time. Once people, I would say that, tell me if your experience is different. Everyone I know who's got an electric vehicle, I have not met a single person who bought an EV, then turned it back in to get another gas car. Once you're in an EV, I think you stay there. And, we've had electric vehicles in my family since 2018, and I wouldn't even think of going back to a gas car. These EVs they're quiet, they're comfortable. 90% of my miles are within, 100 miles of my house. So charging isn't that big a deal for me and my family. So, what do I say to people? I say to people, everyone needs to do their part to stop climate change. And there's some simple steps you can take. Conservation being a big one. Biggest one I would argue is conservation. Don't use as much power. Don't use as much resources. And then, making that change to an EV and getting off fossil fuels in general is a way Vermonters can do their part to fight climate change. And some people will always be against it, right? In time, people will be coming around because the technology gets better and better every year. EVs, the battery, the length, the quality of the cars gets better every year. And I think the same will be those cold climate heat pumps that will help people get rid of their fossil fuel system.
And do you think the electric grid as it's set up currently in Vermont, is it robust enough to handle? It sounds like what we're going to see is more electricity needed for heating, driving. Or do we need to kind of look at the resilience of that grid as it presently exists?
100% yes. Velco, which is the utility that's responsible for all Vermont's transmission and distribution system, they gave the legislature a report that said, as currently it exists, the Vermont grid is capable of handling about 1,000 new megawatts of solar power before you need any new upgrades. That is an awful lot of power. That's a lot of solar power. So we have a grid that's somewhat capable. Now, is that grid ready for every Vermonter or the majority of Vermonters to go solar at home? No. Will there need to be upgrades? Yes. Are the utilities planning to make those upgrades? Yes. We have utilities that are Green Mountain Power, Velco, are committed to getting to 100% renewable. We have 3 utilities, Washington Electric, Burlington, and Swanton, that are already at 100% renewable. Other utilities are moving in that direction. So they know they need to make the upgrades to get to 100% renewable energy. And those, Velco has said they plan on making $500 million in investments by 2028 to upgrade Vermont's grid, particularly up north at the Highgate interchange in that area, to allow more Hydro-Quebec renewable energy to come into Vermont more reliably. So a lot more can be done. The other thing I'd like to add, because it's a great question and I could dork out all day talking about moving power, a big part of this future that will lower costs, and I think the listener should really be thinking about it, is energy storage. When Vermonters put batteries in their house, that helps with decrease the need for more poles and more wires. Also, there's utility scale energy storage. So instead of building a new power line to get 5 megawatts of power in from New York, you could build a 5 megawatt or associate level battery to store power that's generated during the day, right? And that would mean you wouldn't have to build that power line to meet peak demand at night. Think of it like a highway, right? You could either keep building lanes to make the highways bigger just for those few hours when there's a lot of traffic, or you could keep the 2 lanes and incentivize people to get out of their cars by putting buses on there or something. And the energy grid would be the same way. Instead of just building out lots and lots of new power lines and lots of new substations, if we were to incentivize energy storage, that would mean we would not have to build as much new power lines because people could be storing more power just to cut down on the peak demand, because for most times the grid is able to function pretty well, except during those real peaks, real hot weather, real cold weather, something like that.
And I just wondered, let's see, lost my train of thought here. Oh yeah, do you see? Yeah, as I understand it, the H289 bill or statute now requires renewable energy sources by 2030 for all the electricity. Is it, do you think, kind of incumbent or imperative that we eventually get to a point where all that renewable energy sources comes from within the state, within Vermont, or does it matter where it comes from? Is that kind of like?
Oh yeah. No, Vermont will never have the land base necessary to make all of our own renewable power. That will never happen. It's just, it would never be, we just don't have the space to do it. Honestly, we don't have enough sun to do it. We don't have enough places to put wind turbines, even if we want to. We're certainly not flooding anything on the scale we need. So Vermont will always rely on out-of-state power. My guess is, this law calls for 20% of the powers to come from in-state. I think if the technology got really good and we had a robust conversation about some more wind resources in Vermont, we could probably get to 30% in the middle of toward the end of the 2030s, middle of the 2030s. But I would imagine Vermont will always be getting the vast majority, 70, 80% of its power, either from offshore wind off the coast of New England. Hydro-Quebec will probably be a resource that we'll always need. There's large dams in northern New York, north of the, in NIPA, dams that will probably be part of our resource mix. There's some large dams in Maine, large hydro in Maine. But no, Vermont will not, unless there's some unforeseen and unbelievable advance in technology that makes solar panels so incredibly efficient, which is not really coming. The vast majority, 70, 80% of our power will always come from out-of-state resources.
Renewable energy, its cost and availability, will play an important role in Vermont's energy and economic future, along with its climate impact. We are looking forward to providing more commentary on this important subject going forward. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.